Chapter 60 The Castle Part 6 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Oh. Finally. Groaned the old man. Daniel approached the old man with a confident pace. He then pointed the sword downward and pressed its hilt against his chest. Finally, he looked at the old man, and took a deep bow. "I hope you won't change your mind and kill me," Daniel said through an embarrassed smile. The old man showed his rotten teeth once more, and responded, "Don't worry. You and I have much to discuss." He then turned towards the girl whose neck he was holding, and continued, "But first, I hope you won't mind me putting on something a little more comf." Whoosh! The old man's sentence was interrupted by the sound of a sword piercing through air at high speed. But before the sword managed to pierce anything, a large ice blade swiped horizontally and detached Daniel's head from his body. "As if I was born yesterday," said the old man while grinning at the decapitated Daniel. Daniel's head hit the stone pillar, and rolled on the ground for a few meters. Hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the castle. Millions of spiritual cultivators all around the world furrowed their brows in shock. Some of them got distracted during a critical moment and almost lost their lives, while some others had completely interrupted whatever they were doing and turned their head towards the same direction. All of these spiritual cultivators had a deep comprehension of time essence, and no matter how far in the world, these powerful cultivators felt a global interruption of the omnipresent time law. Golden Cauldron, Main Branch. A very old, yet lively-looking man was quietly sitting in front of a boiling pot. The room's furniture looked simple, but every bit of it had been constructed by extremely rare and expensive materials. The old man's head turned towards the direction of the castle, and muttered to himself, "I wonder what kind of old monster managed to control the laws of time to this extent." This man was called Golden Cauldron, and he was the silver alchemist's father, and president of the company Golden Cauldron. Back in the castle, Daniel's head rolled backwards on the floor, hit the stone pillar once again, and flew back above Daniel's shoulders. It then reattached itself to his neck the very moment the ice blade passed between them. Putting on something a little more. Company WJ. Whoosh! Once again, the sound of a sword piercing through air interrupted the old man's speech. Unfortunately, it didn't stop him from casting an ice blade once again, and send it slashing horizontally at Daniel's neck. Daniel was prepared this time. He lowered his head just in time to avoid the slashing blade, and managed to pierce the old man's chest from part to part. All of a sudden, the formation activated once again. The people's surroundings changed back, and the horrific and gory castle turned back into a simpler yet still spectral black and white. Inside the real catacomb, Daniel was standing still while pressed against the old man's body. At his feet, two differently colored streams of blood were pooling and merging into a strange black and dark red mixture. Fresh blood started to drip down the corners of Daniel's lips. The petite girl managed to free herself from the dead body's grip, and after a few gasps for air, she composed herself, and looked at Daniel. She thought that Daniel had sold her out to the old man, and that she was doomed, but that had all been a ruse to get closer to him, and launch a sneak attack. Relieved of the outcome, she approached Daniel. But before she could pat on his shoulder, she noticed the heavy bleeding. Daniel's legs finally gave up, and he nearly fell on his back. Fortunately, the petite girl was right behind him, so she easily catched him and laid him gently on the floor. On his chest, she saw various large holes. These holes had been caused by a last-moment attack of the clear mage, which in a moment of panic, created various wooden spikes between himself and Daniel. When Daniel fearlessly threw his body at him, he ended up impaling himself. Now bleeding severely, Daniel lied on the floor. The girl's small hands were pressing on the wounds, trying to stop the bleeding, and at the same time, shock covered her face as she noticed that Daniel's body was that of a rank 4 martial cultivator. Fortunately, she didn't let that distract her from the matter at hand. She started to rummage into her backpack, but before she could find what she was looking for, Daniel's words reached her ears. "The tomb. Burn the mother's coffin. No time, he said while spewing copious amount of blood. The girl was unwilling to leave him like that, so she kept searching inside her bag. Daniel's trembling hand touched her small knee gently, and as he got her attention, he focused all of his spiritual essence to his injuries, and turned it into healing essence. The petite girl noticed the stopping of the blood flow, and the very slow yet constant recovery of Daniel's flesh. It was like watching a high-level healing pill slowed to 1/100th of the speed, and yet, it was still able to stabilize him. Daniel's main concern was to recover the damage to his organs. He had various holes in his stomach, one of his lungs had been punctured, and a huge slash almost cut his liver in half. These points were where he focused most of the healing essence to, while the remaining bit, saw use to stop the bleeding. Seemingly on his deathbed, Daniel summoned a small ball of fire, and used it to burn the old man's clothes. Seeing that Daniel had everything under control, the petite girl got up on her feet, ripped the large burning piece of the old man's robe and rolled it up around her sword. She then started walking towards the double doors. She slowly pushed the heavy doors open, letting the stale air hit her face. The moment the door was opened, a streak of weak spiritual essence dashed from the coffin, towards her, but before the spiritual essence could reach its destination, a lightning bolt appeared in the air and struck it, making it dissipate. After fending off an attempt to take possession of the girl's body, Daniel tried to shout, but what came out of his mind was a feeble "now." Despite not being able to hear him, the girl rapidly approached the solitary wooden casket in the middle of the room, and threw the flaming piece of fabric above it. She then retreated back out of the room, closing the large double doors behind, and approached Daniel once again. The moment she reached him, he had already lost consciousness. The girl knew that the last 2 attacks had been more than Daniel could take. Focusing on healing himself, while at the same time protecting her from the attempts of possession from the clear mage, was too much for Daniel to handle. Therefore he had passed out, allowing his blood to start flowing out of his wounds once again. When Daniel woke up, before he could even gather his bearings, he noticed an opened window within his mind. This window was very small, but its content made Daniel happy beyond words. No rest for the wicked second objective completed. Reward: 137,500 karma points. Once closed the window, Daniel looked at his surroundings, and noticed that he was still lying on the floor of the catacomb. His head was resting on a grey robe, which emanated a nice smell. His first instinct was to look down to his chest. He immediately noticed that any sort of wound had been healed, and no trace of their presence whatsoever had been left behind. He lifted his upper body, and started to look around. Sitting next to the short stone column, was a girl. This girl had smooth skin of a clean olive color, and medium-sized hair that flowed gently down the sides of her head. Her straight black eyebrows stood proudly above a pair of dark brown eyes, which were currently directed at the sandwich she was eating. She couldn't be considered shockingly beautiful, but her cold demeanor more than made up for it. Daniel couldn't recognize her face, but her familiar body size rapidly betrayed her identity. She was the petite girl. The girl noticed the movement coming from Daniel's direction. She was about to say something, but before she could, Daniel interjected and said, "The best 100 gold coins I've ever spent." After a moment of confusions, the two bursted into a tired and heartfelt laugh. "That I'm sorry for taking one of the pills," she said embarrassedly. A faint grin grew on Daniel's face, as he looked at her and responded, "I should thank you for safekeeping a pill for me. Or, as stupid as I am, I would have ended up using it that very night." After a few minutes of embarrassing silence, the petite girl said, "I'm Alice, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Alice, I'm Dan," responded Daniel while getting back up on his feet, and ignoring that she already knew his name. He started to slowly explore the catacomb, trying to see if there was anything of value inside. At the same time, a few ideas on how to use his large amount of karma points came to his mind. After a few minutes of consideration, and unfruitful search, he decided to purchase the system's permanent passive ability called Karma X Luck, which dictated Daniel's luck, according to the amount of positive or negative karma he possessed. With more than 100,000 karma points left, he approached Alice, and after taking a coin out of his pocket, he told her, heads or tails. Why would play heads or tails? She asked with curiosity, then continued, Did you find something good? No, I just want to play. Pick 1 inch, he quickly responded. Heads, she said, right before Daniel sent the coin flying high up in the air. When it reached the ground, its head side slowly landed on the ground. It was tails. A few more, said Daniel. The two played heads or tails for 10 minutes, during which Daniel won 40 out of 40.3 tosses. Strangely irritated by the result, Alice challenged Daniel at rock, paper, scissors. Which Daniel decided to play with his eyes closed, and abandoning all tactics. One game after the other, 10 more minutes passed. During these 10 minutes, Daniel had won 115 games out of 129. Alice's tactics couldn't help her against Daniel's sheer luck. With closed eyes, he would simply throw a figure at the last moment, and most of the times, that figure would be the right one. After another heavy defeat, Alice observed the excited expression on Daniel's face. She then asked him, the clear mage called you a monstrosity. Has the fact that you have a rank 5 spirit and rank 4 body something to do with it? Without looking back at her, Daniel responded nonchalantly, he was right. But he didn't know the half of it. Ignoring his boasts, Alice continued, how is it possible? Well, it's too late for you, so let it be a secret of mine for a while longer. He responded while getting back up on his feet. He then started walking towards the large double door. How old are you really? You can't really be in your early teens. You must at least be 20.5. She said while trying to get his attention back. Amused by the girl's words, Daniel turned his body around, and while walking backwards, he said, believe it or not, I am only 4. His bragging was interrupted by his sudden loss of balance, caused by him stumbling upon one of the old man's foot. Daniel couldn't help but reach for anything he could grab during the fall. The only thing present to grab was the hilt of the sword. The moment he touched the hilt sword, a heavy amount of information started to pour into Daniel's mind. They were all informations about the formation. Its workings, the weak points, the way to control it. He knew everything. He rapidly took the copy he had made of the Trap Formations project, and suddenly, he could understand everything within it. Apparently, the formation was never supposed to only work as a trap for the clear mage, but also as a prison. And where there was a prison, a jailer would be there to guard him. Chapter 61 Good things are never free. You are listening at novelfull.audio. What's wrong? Asked Alice to the seemingly distracted Daniel. The girl's silvery voice woke Daniel up from his surprise. He turned towards her, and said, I must have randomly activated something. And now I think I can terminate the formation at will. Alice's eyes moved around Daniel's surroundings, and only when they ended up on the puddle of blood on which the rotting old man was lying, did a guess formed in her head. It has to have something to do with your blood, she said while indicating the puddle of mixed blood. Daniel, now completely aware of the structure and workings of the formation, looked back at Alice and said, it really does have something to do with blood, but not mine. Apparently, your family's blood is required to start the formation. It works like a door lock, and the sword is the key. He then paused for a moment before continuing, this formation has been created to trap someone which belongs to your family. So what now? Asked Alice. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face, as he said, now, it seems that I have become some sort of guardian. I think that this was once the Dark Warrior's job. But when he activated the defective formation, he must have been absorbed by it. That should explain why I've had those visions. Does that mean that you are stuck here? Alice asked. I don't think so. You know how the castle teleports from one place to another every 10 years. Also, remember the large air bubble that surrounded the castle, and kept it floating in the air. Large wind and spatial spheres have been installed as integral parts of the formation. Responded Daniel before closing his eyes and saying, "Look at this." 2 minutes passed uneventfully. Confused, Alice decided to say something, but as she was about to start talking, she heard steps coming from the dark corridor that lead to the main hall. One after the other, Highmark and the rest of their group appeared within the catacomb. "What the hell is going on here?" asked Legart animatedly. Each of them, like Daniel and Alice, had been isolated within the fictitious space the very moment they had set foot into the castle. They had challenged the various training rooms, and had been able to pass them with relative ease thanks to their decades of training. Daniel was the only one who had had to spend so much time inside the weapon-wielding training room, as unfortunately, he hadn't been able to grow up while training in the more advanced stages of swordsmanship. On the other hand, the rest of the participants, being geniuses and prodigies of their respective groups, had had the chance to train since a very young age. In comparison, before Daniel managed to train inside the training room within the castle, he had only been able to learn the basics of swordsmanship. After passing their tests, Daniel's group had been forced to wander the fictitious castle, waiting for the clear mage to kill them and consume them. It was only when Daniel had extracted the sword, that they were briefly able to see the true appearance of the castle, along with the tens of corpses, walls covered in dried blood, and bones scattered everywhere. Fortunately, that had only lasted since the moment Daniel took the sword out, to when he pierced the old man's body with it. After that, the fictitious space had been reformed, and the castle had gone back to being how they used to see it before. Now in control of the formation, Daniel had picked his group members one by one and directed them towards the catacomb. Once there, he dissolved the fictitious space they were in, and allowed them to enter the true catacomb in which he and Alice were staying. Daniel explained everything that happened to the rest of the group. "So, are you able to get us all out of here?" Highmark asked to him. Daniel looked back at him and said, "Even better. I think I can move the castle altogether." "Wait a second, before you try anything, I think there is something important to discuss. Now that you have gained control over the formation, where is the inheritance?" asked Legart with a large nasty smile on his face. "I have no idea. The original formation had been tampered with in many occasions. The first time, when the clear mage had hidden part of his consciousness into the coffin. The moment the formation was activated, everyone within the castle had disappeared. The only things remaining were the key and the lock of the formation," said Daniel disappointedly, before taking a deep breath and continuing, "If there was something, it either disappeared then, or was taken by the first people who visited this place." "What about the rewards we got from the training rooms?" Paul promptly asked. Daniel shrugged his shoulders, and said, "Not part of the formation. My guess is that every 10 years, the clear mage would use the possessions of the participants he had previously killed as small rewards meant to please the participants, and lure more of them back the next time." Alice suddenly recalled something. She looked at Daniel and asked, "You have mentioned visions before. What were they about?" "Memories. Fragments of the Dark Warrior's memories which I assume got stuck within the formation when things went wrong the first time." Daniel responded in a slightly unsure tone. Thought it was Highmark's time to interject. He looked at Daniel and asked him, "So what did you gain from this?" A large smile appeared on Daniel's face. He looked at the rest of the group and said, "Follow me." The group walked into the dark corridor and reached the main hall. Once in the main hall, they approached the large double door. Daniel looked at his group members once more, then, he opened the door. What appeared on the other side wasn't the large expanse of murky water that they expected to see. Instead, it was the large field that surrounded the lake in which the castle had been hidden. "We've teleported?" asked a visibly shocked Highmark. "No, I don't have the comprehension of space required to control that part of the formation. I've simply moved the castle here by using wind essence. Responded Daniel quickly. Another thing the group noticed was the absence of the spiritual essence in the air. The tournament had been originally created by the clear mage as a pretext to attract as many cultivators as possible, so when the formation had been reset, its barrier had been modified. Originally, the barrier should have surrounded the castle, and its power should have been equivalent to the power of its activator. Specifically, the Dark Warrior. Unfortunately, when the clear mage had managed to take partial control over the formation, he had been able to use the key barrier, along with his spiritual essence, for his own gains. Turning a once powerful key barrier into a selective process for the participants of the tournament. The spiritual essence in the air had disappeared when the formation had been reset, and the key barrier was now weak, and barely able to stop people at Daniel's stage of martial cultivation. Speaking of which, we better be on our way soon. Because when the powerful cultivators who accompanied their young masters or children here will notice the disappearance of the barrier, they'll come for the castle. And fast. Said Daniel in a hurried tone. Before any of the others could say anything, he waved his hand in the air and forced every single participant still within the castle to be kicked out. He then made the castle fly high up in the sky, and take off in the distance. The castle's speed was only as fast as Daniel's flight speed, as he was only able to control so much of that part of the formation with the comprehension of wind essence he had. Standing at the opened entrance of the castle, Daniel looked at the island get smaller and smaller in the distance. He then looked back at his group and said, "What do you guys want to do? I can drop you off after we reach land if you want." Unexpectedly, his question was answered with another question. This question came from Heimart: "What are your plans?" "I will travel in one direction, and hope to find clues about the right way to go back home," responded Daniel. After a minute of silence, Legart said, "We are in no hurry to go back. We were supposed to be on a 10 years journey before going back to the school. If you would like some company, I wouldn't mind occupying one of the many rooms here." "Sure," responded Daniel excitedly. He had absolutely no idea of which direction to take in order to reach the Carolus kingdom. So he might as well go in the general direction where his group members had come from. At least then he could have some travel companions for a while. "Speaking of rooms," said Heimart before taking a long pause and continuing, "I want the biggest one." "What?" The single word bursted right out of Legart's mouth. "Hold on a second. It was my ID." Before he could finish, Daniel interjected, "Settle down you two. There is still one small problem with the castle," he said with an extremely uncomfortable tone. "It needs cleaning," he said while waving his hand, and taking the lot of them out of the fictitious space. The hall was filled with bones and dust, and trails of fresh blood could be seen going in all directions. Legart's tone changed completely, and after breathing in through his gritted teeth, he said, "Yeah. I don't want to stay anymore." 1 week later. The small group of 7 had managed to clean the majority of the lower floor of the castle, mostly thanks to Daniel's water magic. He had also been able to drive off the nauseating stench by creating air currents which brought fresh air from the outside, to every small nook and cranny within the castle. Various rooms had been cleaned as well. Enough for each of them to take one. They 7 of them were now sitting at a long and elegant table in the dining room. They slowly ate their food, and yet, the atmosphere was strange. Legart brought his fork towards his mouth, and right when he was about to bite at the piece of vegetable pierced on its prongs, Heimart, which was currently sitting opposite to him, looked at him intently and said, "Remember when there was a human's foot right where your plate is right now." With an annoyed expression, Legart put his fork back on the plate, and pushed the plate away from himself. On the other side of the table, Heimart looked at Paul, who was currently sitting to his right, and while giggling, he said, "It never gets old." Alice, which sat next to Daniel at the far edge of the table, said, "You really need to buy new furniture for this place." Noticing the low morale of the group, Daniel stood up, and after putting his open hand on the table, he made thousands of small rings and bags appear out of nowhere. He looked at the surprised group, and said in a loud voice, "This was supposed to be a surprise for after we finished cleaning, but honestly, if I hear Heimart's joke one more time, I am going to leave the castle myself. So here we go." He then pointed at the mountain of bags and rings, and while smiling, he continued, "These are all the spatial containers of tens of thousands of years of dead participants. I haven't touched them yet." Satisfied by the shocked faces of the group, he sat back on his chair, and after picking a ring, he said, "Knock yourself out." Without the need of being told twice, everyone grabbed a large handful of spatial containers and started to check out their content. The previous thoughts of past murders and gory scenes had disappeared completely from their heads. Chapter 62A Traveler's Plan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The group spent the next 5 hours going through every ring and bag that Daniel had taken out. What they found was highly disappointing. Most of the good items had been taken out by the clear mage when he had killed the owners of these rings and bags. What was left were the coins, and the martial and spiritual cultivation manuals. Having a lot of money is fine, but there isn't anything of real use here. I think we should sell all this stuff in block at an high-end auction house. We could split the money, and use some of it to decorate the castle, said Paul. Daniel still hadn't gotten used to such a large sum of money. To him, who was used to live off of a few copper coins per day, millions of gold coins were an astronomical number. Regarding the cultivation resources and useful objects, they had been long taken by the clear mage, who used them as little rewards to attract cultivators in to join the tournament. An example of this were the beast cores given in the cultivation talent tests, and the essence treasures rewarded at the completion of the essence comprehension test. The first test was different. Daniel had thought about the possibility that those orbs he had used to increase his comprehension of lightning essence could be somewhere within the castle, but unfortunately, after he had obtained full control over the formation, he had found none of them. It didn't take long for him to formulate a guess regarding why. What Daniel had seen weren't essence spheres, but essence orbs. These orbs were larger and different than the essence spheres he had encountered in the past. The use of these orbs was to showcase the type of essence they contained, and to be placed in the small carving on the table so that the essence contained in them could be displayed. They didn't have a binding treasure that could separate and keep the essence independent from the cultivator. What he believed these essence orbs to be were simply a demonstrative tool used by the clear mage to show off a specific essence he had a deep comprehension of. Daniel wasn't sure if that was the real reason, but since all the training rooms aside from the weapon mastery training room had disappeared since the very moment the formation had been reset, he had good reasons to believe that was the case. "It will take a while longer to get to the next city," said Daniel while looking at the map he had purchased in Ceralis. "Do you guys have someplace you want to visit? I am flying blind here." "About that, you've mentioned Ceralis more than once. If that kingdom is as far as you say it is, how did you end up to Ceralis without even knowing it?" asked a curious Imblin. Without taking his eyes off the map, Daniel took a deep breath and said, "I am the progenitor of a new path of cultivation. This new path allows you to practice both spiritual cultivator and martial cultivator. When I've entered the 4th rank, I caused a cultivation anomaly right in the middle of the city. The event was witnessed by all the most powerful cultivators in the city, including 2 spies who belonged to 2 different neighboring kingdoms. These spies reported what they saw back to their respective kingdoms, which sent people from their territories to kidnap me. A 3-way battle amongst 3 different kingdoms broke out in the city. My teachers were outnumbered and almost defeated, so they used what I assume was their backup plan. They opened a portal which brought me to Ceralis's beach. You know the rest." The expressions on the faces of the 6 were beyond what someone could describe as shocked. They were so amazed that they dropped everything they were holding in their hands. Alice looked at Daniel with shock and asked him, "Why the hell would you say that?" Slightly annoyed, Daniel put the map down and looked at the rest of the group. He then said, "Look, I don't want to spend all day avoiding grazing your arms because you would find out I have a body at the 4th rank of martial cultivation. If we have to travel together for a while, I might as well tell you guys the truth. What Daniel said made sense, but at the same time, it was the craziest thing they had ever heard in their lives. Legart looked at Daniel, and with a dubious tone, he said, "Look, you don't have to tell us the real reason if you do." Schweiing before Legart could finish, Daniel took his sword out of his spatial ring, and after injecting his key into it, he slashed vertically, splitting a chair in half. He then looked back at the map and said, "Now you believe me." Legart's shock immediately turned into curiosity. He immediately stood up from his chair, got closer to Daniel and asked him, "How did you do it? How did you become a martial cultivator?" Alice threw a gelid look at him, as if he had asked the most personal question a human being could ask to another, but before she could add some words to her cold look, she heard Daniel's voice. One again, without moving his eyes away from the map, Daniel casually responded, "I have cultivated to the peak of the 3rd rank of both paths, reached perfection of both body and connection at the same time, and then, when attempting to reach the 4th rank, I've entered a state of semi-unconsciousness which allowed me to break through in both stages at the same time." "What the hell is happening?" said the shocked Alice. "Did you just give away one of the most important informations in history? What is wrong with you?" "Big deal, 3 kingdoms are already aware of the method. And sooner or later the news will spread. The faster another cultivator capable to accomplish the double path of cultivation appears, the less people I'll have on my tail," Daniel said with a matter-of-fact tone. The group was unsure of how to react at this point. They didn't know if they should feel happy about learning one of the most valuable informations in the entire history of cultivation, or if they should curse the fact that they hadn't heard it sooner. The reason for their conflicting feelings was the fact that they would never be able to accomplish what Daniel described, as they had already reached the 4th stage of martial cultivation. The only one who still had a chance at doing that was Rowley. 4 hours passed before the group managed to finish going through every single spatial container. Heimart stood in front of the piles of coins and manuals and said, 874 arts belonging to the martial path, and 167 arts belonging to the spiritual path, a few tens of thousands of decent weapons, and finally, about 5 million of gold coins. I suggest we get 500,000 each, and the rest goes into renovating the castle. We can sell the rest of the items." Daniel looked at the rest and said, "Hold on, we should keep the books. There is an enormous empty library in the west wing of the castle." "All right," said Heimart, "selling other schools and sects' private arts is a risky business anyway. About a map. What would you think about going to the Crehan Empire's capital, and find a cartographer? I know that there is a group there that deals with mapping the territory around the empire," said Alice to Daniel. Daniel had heard about empires before, but from what he knew, the closest empire to Carolus was hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, and its name definitely wasn't Crehan. "I have no problems with your suggestion," he said with a slightly enthusiastic tone. "Very well, they also have the biggest auction houses. I am sure we will find one where we can sell all these weapons," Alice added. The rest of the group rapidly agreed on visiting the Crehan Empire. They all knew the directions of their hometowns, and at their stage of cultivation, a few more thousand kilometers weren't a big problem. Legart intervened in the discussion to say, "Aren't you forgetting something? We are soaring the skies. In a flying castle." A flying castle wasn't an overall impossible thing to see in this world, as it simply required a formation, and a spiritual cultivator with a profound comprehension of wind essence to be created. Unfortunately, this area didn't house cultivators of such mastery. The Clear Mage was an exception, and that was one of the reasons for his fame. Approaching an empire's capital with a flying castle would certainly be seen as a provocation to the emperor. So the group had no choice but to decide to leave the castle somewhere far away from the city, and come back for it after they finished with their businesses. The group spent the next 2 months practicing their martial arts, training their weapon-wielding abilities in the training room, and cleaning the rest of the castle. They couldn't get used to eating and living on items covered in dried blood, so they stopped more than once on their way to the Crehan Empire to purchase furniture and redecorate the castle. This was something that Alice was strangely good at, as being part of an ancient family, she was used to living in a refined and classy house. She had developed a good eye for high-class furniture. In this past 2 months, Daniel had practiced many times inside the weapon-wielding training room, and had reached an astonishing level of proficiency in many different weapons. Amongst which were various types of swords, great swords and polearms. His cultivation had momentarily slowed down when he finished consuming the last of the rank 4 beast cores his teachers had given him. He was currently sitting on an elegant chair inside his room, and observing the opened window within his mind. Dan Heel. Karmic Systems wielder. Age. 15 rank. Late rank 5 of martial cultivation, perfect body. Late rank 5 of spiritual cultivation, perfect connection, karma. 87,790. Weapons masteries, details, martial arts, details, skills, details, spells, details. Reap what you've sown. Time is precious. LV.4 reduced cost. LV.4 second chance. LV.1 karma x luck system upgrades, details. Daniel still couldn't believe how fast his karmic system helped him to grow in power. Less than 4 months had passed since he had activated it, and he had already reached a level of cultivation that only an ordinary middle-aged man should possess. Of course, he would never mention to anyone that he had only started to practice less than half a month ago, or people would become suspicious. As he was now, he could still pass for a genius amongst geniuses, as his talent in cultivation would still be considered near impossible to see, but not as unrealistic as the truth. The rest of the group was not far behind. Thanks to the significant amount of money they had obtained, they were able to purchase all the cultivation resources they needed. Unfortunately for Daniel, none of the few cities they had stopped at had rank 5 beast cores to sell. And even if they did, he would stop cultivating in order to avoid reaching a stage considered impossible for his age. Rowley had been the member of the group that had made the least amount of progress. He didn't have a special room for spiritual cultivators to learn and practice magic arts into, so he could only ask Daniel for help. Daniel had helped him more than once in the past couple of weeks, and had even studied the method to create essence spheres so that Rowley could increase his comprehension on the essences Daniel was best at. Specifically lightning, water and wind. His help was much appreciated, but unfortunately, didn't bear much fruit. Rowley wasn't talented in comprehending arts, and the process of making essence spheres required specific steps which Daniel was unaware of. The only progress Rowley managed to make was in his cultivation level. In 2 months, he had gone from peak rank 3 to late rank 4. The rest, aside from Imblin who was at the peak of the 4th rank, had just entered the 5th rank. Chapter 63 Things are not always as they appear. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It took more than 1 week for Daniel and the rest of the group to reach the borders of the Crehan Empire. Signaling the border was a small city called Gia. In order to avoid their castle from being spotted in mid-air while crossing the border, the group had no other choice but to hide it into a deep lake situated only 20 kilometers away from the city. They then traveled the rest of the road on foot. When Daniel and the rest approached the city of Gia, they noticed various columns of gray smoke rise from it, and merge into a large cloud of smoke. After a moment of hesitation, the 7 of them proceeded towards the city. Screaming noises, along with sounds of clashing metal weapons, resounded in the air, becoming louder the more they came close to the city walls. The guards that were supposed to guard the gates lied unmoving on the ground instead, and their bodies were covered in shocking wounds. On the ground, along with a dozen dead city guards, was a strange-looking corpse. Daniel had never seen a body like it. The body had a humanoid shape, and was muscular and tough-looking. Its skin was dark red, as if covered in dried blood. One of the ears on the sides of the head had been cut off, and it didn't appear to have been done recently, as the wound had long cicatrized. The mouth didn't appear to be different than that of a normal human with thin lips, but between the two opened lips, a set of pointy and sharp teeth could be seen. The eye color of this humanoid was bright yellow and his nose was quite large. "An Assam," said Heimart in a low and unsurprised voice. Daniel turned towards him and asked, "Do you know what that thing is?" "Yeah." "You don't?" asked Heimart curiously. Then, after recalling that Daniel wasn't from this area, he continued, "The Asams are one of the humanoid races that live in this continent. They are divided into tribes, which inhabit the territory immediately west from the Crehan Empire. They are generally hostile in nature, and their primary way of obtaining resources is to raid the cities placed in their borders." Daniel had never heard of Asams, or any other type of humanoid races, but he understood what the informations Heimart had given to him meant. "The city is being raided," Daniel muttered in a low voice. "Definitely. We should leave before we get spotted," said Heimart with a hint of urgency in his voice. "Shouldn't we lend a help?" asked Daniel as he heard Heimart's words. Heimart shook his head and said, "There is no point. These small cities at the borders are only inhabited by slaves, bureaucrats and small-level guards. I don't think they can stand a chance against an Assam's raiding party. If we join in the defense, we will likely end up fighting for the losing side." The group was about to leave, when suddenly, a party composed of 9 large Assam warriors appeared from behind one side of the gate. Some of them held long poles in their hands, on which several severed heads had been impaled, while the others were dragging chained humans and large sacks. Daniel's group was immediately spotted by the party, and before they could attempt to turn around and leave, they heard a few incomprehensible words coming from the party of warriors. "Kurl ja privijchi. Gur huya," said one of the Assam warriors with a deep and hoarse voice. The 9 of them immediately let go of what they were holding, and unsheathed the blades they carried on their backs. "Does any of you know what that one said?" asked Daniel curiously. Imblin's voice came from behind him and said, "Just know that, before unsheathing their weapons, they called us fresh meat." The 9 warriors were only a small part of the raiding party. Their martial cultivation level wasn't high, as their entire job was to kill unranked humans, and pillage the city while the strongest members of the party would held the city's highest-ranking human cultivators back. Their average cultivation level was at the late 4th rank, with only 2 at the early 5th rank. Unfortunately for them, they had appeared at the wrong moment and picked on the wrong people. A sword suddenly appeared in Daniel's hand, and before any of the Assam warriors could react, Daniel disappeared from the spot he was standing on. When he reappeared, he was in the middle of the group of Assam warriors. His sword had already separated one of the warriors' heads from the rest of his body, and without stopping, it approached a second warrior. The group quickly came out of their shocked state, and those who were standing behind Daniel immediately tried to slash at his back. But before their blades could reach Daniel, 2 small lightning bolts came out of his back and struck the 2 warriors dead. The slashing motion of Daniel's sword was interrupted when the blade got stuck into the second warrior's spine. Daniel gave up on the sword, and while turning around, he threw 2 knives which sunk deeply into the skulls of 2 more warriors. Scared out of their wits, the remaining 3 started to run away, but before they could go far, various small spikes rose from under their feet and nailed them to the ground. Panicked and in pain, the 3 tried to free themselves. The very next moment, a horizontal bright light blue-colored line passed through their bodies, splitting them into 2 parts. The entire scene had happened in less than 10 seconds. Without a single drop of blood staining his clothes, Daniel walked amongst the corpses of the 9 warriors and freed the chained humans. Please help our city. They are killing the kids and the elderly," said a woman in her mid-30s amongst them. Unwilling to leave things as they were, Daniel turned to look at Heimart. Heimart immediately understood Daniel's intentions. After thinking for a minute, with a resigned expression he said, "Fine. Assam raiding parties usually are composed of cultivators below the 6th rank. If there are any at the 6th rank or above, they will be distracting the mining company's guards, highest-ranking military, and finally, the city lord. As long as we avoid large parties, we shouldn't be in any danger. Satisfied by Heimart's response, Daniel led the group into the city with a faint smile on his face. Under the guide of one of the people they had rescued, Daniel and the rest roamed within the small city, killing off any small party of raiders they found. Just 2 hours after their arrival, night enshrouded the city in a darkness in which only the faint lights of the fires were allowed to dance into. Sounds of fighting could be heard all around the city, followed by screams and begs. Daniel and the rest had just finished exterminating a relatively big group of warriors, when suddenly, they heard deafening sounds of metal clashing against metal coming from somewhere nearby. While Alice and the rest accompanied a few survivors to safety through the path they had cleaned, Daniel approached the area where the fight was taking place. After he turned to the last corner, what appeared in front of his eyes surprised him greatly. A teenager boy was wielding a blade similar to those the Assam warriors carried, and using it to fend off the attacks of at least 30 warriors by himself. This teenager boy had an athletic build, and his muscles were very well defined. His figure was extremely similar to Daniel's, except for the fact that Daniel was a little shorter due to the younger age. His hair were of a golden blonde color, which he kept to a semi-short length. His plain and tattered clothes were in complete contrast with his proud and cold demeanor showed by his expression. Daniel could see his cultivation rank clearly. He was a peak rank 5 martial cultivator, which was an impressive feat for a kid which looked to be no older than 18. Above this young man's head, Daniel could see a red 429, which indicated his bad karma. What left Daniel confused, was the small group of children crouched behind the man. They were hugging each other and crying loudly. One after another, the young man deflected all of the large group's attacks, and in time, he even managed to kill a few of them. His expression grew increasingly more tired the more he fought. After a couple more minutes of fighting, a loud voice resounded in the air. Tra sje yanungi triafjor. As the warriors heard this voice, they immediately stopped fighting. The blonde young man wasn't an exception. They then split into 2 groups to form a path for the voice's owner to pass through. Daniel turned to look at the source of the voice, and what he saw, was an extremely large Assam warrior, which held a massive blade on each of his hand. The young man looked back at him, and said in a proud tone, Tu neen vij sidfjor. Krj tu neen staya. The large Assam warrior's face twisted in anger. He pointed his 2 blades at the young man, and then rushed at him. From the outburst in speed, Daniel could see that the large Assam warrior was at least an early 6th rank martial cultivator. Once the 2 started to engage in battle, the young man immediately found himself on the losing end. Thankfully, his agility helped him avoid most of his opponent's attacks. The rest of the warriors didn't join the battle, and instead, stayed away from the 2 and approached the group of children. The moment the warriors started to walk towards the children, the blonde young man turned his attention away from the large warrior, and slashed at the back of one of the warriors. His action costed him a bloody injury on his back, as the large warrior showed no mercy and attacked the very moment the young man's attention moved away from him. There was no way for the young man to protect the children alone, and yet, he acquired injury after injury by the hands of the larger warrior, each while trying to defend the kids from the group of warriors. Learning from their previous mistakes, the remaining warriors approached the kids from another side, preventing the young man from supporting them. Once the warriors arrived next to the group of crying children, they all lifted their hands, and just as they were about to slash downwards, they noticed a large pool of water form from out of nowhere, and expand at their feet. Before they could even guess the possibility of an enemy attack, the water started to crawl over their bodies, and slowly sunk into the pores of their skin. It then cooled down at an extremely fast rate. The cold water pushed through their blood vessels, joined their bloodstream and, after reaching their heart, solidified it into a frozen state. Only 5 5th rank warriors had survived the attack by creating a ki shield right underneath their skin, and preventing the water from sinking deeper into their bodies. The remaining 5 warriors turned around, and looked for the attacker. What they found, was a young man with his back pressed on a building, as if he was resting. The large warrior and the young man noticed Daniel as well. With an enraged tone, the large man looked at the remaining 5 warriors and shouted, "Stah!" After hearing the large Assam's words, the 5 ignored the crying children and immediately rushed at Daniel. Just in time, the rest of Daniel's group had returned from accompanying the survivors to a safe zone in the city. They immediately engaged against the 5 warriors, and in about 2 minutes, thanks to their advantage in number, they took care of the 5. Legart noticed the ongoing battle between the blonde young man and the large Assam warrior. He then looked at Daniel and said, "Aren't we going to help him?" Daniel didn't respond, and instead, looked at the young man carefully. It had been the first time he had seen someone with a red name do something good, so he wasn't exactly sure on how to proceed. Chapter 64 A Warrior Worth Serving. You are listening at novelfull.audio. For the next few minutes, Daniel and the rest of his group observed the fight between the blonde young man and the large Assam warrior. Because of the few injuries he had obtained when defending the children, the young man had gradually lost blood and become weaker. It had reached a point where he was only barely able to avoid the warriors' attacks. Daniel quietly approached the group of kids and tried to talk to them. He got down on his knees and looked at the only one of them who was watching the fight, a little girl with ponytails which seemed to be 6 or 7 years old. "Little girl. Do you know that guy?" asked Daniel while indicating the blonde young man. The scared little girl looked back at Daniel. "He was with them," she said while looking at the various corpses on the ground. "Then why is he fighting that Assam warrior?" he asked back with a confused tone. The large eyes of the little girl started to water as she said, "They were going to attack us. But the blonde big brother turned against them and defended us." With a clear idea of what had happened, Daniel approached Imblin and said, "Can you tell me what tu neen vij sid fire? Krj tu neen staya means?" Imblin looked curiously at Daniel and said, "It's fjor, and it means, I will have no master after I will kill you." She then looked at the blonde young man and said, "Did he say it?" Daniel nodded in confirmation. "He is the Cry," she said with a shocked face. Imblin's words made the heads of the rest of the group turn towards her in unison. Not a single one of them less shocked than Imblin was. "What is a Cry?" asked Daniel curiously. Imblin looked at Daniel and said, "The dirt warrior." She then took a slight pause before continuing, "A dirt warrior is a slave who earned the right to become a warrior and to cultivate." "Earned the right how exactly?" asked Daniel. "It's basically a competition amongst Assam warriors. Each high-ranking warrior captures a single infant to bring back home from a successful raid campaign. They then train them until they reach the age of 10. Once reached the 10th year of age, they get thrown into an arena, and the one who survives, obtains the title of Cry. To symbolize a warrior that came from dirt," explained Imblin patiently. Now aware of the reason for the young man's bad karma, Daniel looked at Imblin and said, "What do you think is happening here? Cry are warriors, but still slaves. It is possible that the guy rebelled to his master to protect those children," promptly responded Imblin. Daniel had learned before that, amongst the group, Imblin was the one whose house was the closest to the Assam's territory. In fact, her city was attacked by Assam's raiding parties more than once before. Luckily, her city had very powerful warriors and mages which made every attempt of raiding it a complete failure. A doubt started to form in Daniel's mind as he asked her, couldn't he be trying to kill his master to earn his freedom? Before Daniel could ponder on this theory, Imblin quickly refuted it by saying, "Definitely not. It's impossible for an Assam slave to regain his or her freedom. They are considered spoil of war. They would be willing to free one of their slaves just like they would be willing to go back to the city they pillaged, and give back the money they stole." As Daniel and Imblin discussed the young man's motives, the battle amongst him and the large Assam warrior was about to come to an end. His body was covered in cuts and blood, and he was now barely able to avoid the attacks. A heavy punch to the chest finally brought him to the ground, and it didn't seem like he would be able to get back up anytime soon. The large Assam warrior started to laugh at him, as the only injury he had received was a shallow cut on his forearm. He then slowly walked towards the blond young man and said, "Nidra yes jam. He, as dirt you die," said Imblin with a feeble voice. Ping, the sound of two throwing knives suddenly hitting the two Assam warriors' blades could be heard resound in the air. Once Daniel had heard Imblin's words, without thinking, he had thrown the knives to attract the warrior's attention. Luckily, it worked. The Assam warrior turned towards him while still holding his two enormous blades. Daniel was standing at the head of his group. He directly looked at the yellow eyes of the Assam warriors, and before saying anything, a second sword appeared in his free hand. A large smile grew on the Assam warrior's face. He then started to walk towards him. While the two walked towards each other, Legart looked at Alice and Heimart and said, "Shouldn't we help?" Just as the two were about to agree with him, Imblin stopped them and said, "Wait. Let's see if he can make it on his own first. Because if he can, she then let the sentence die in her mouth." One of the skills Daniel had practiced during the past couple of months was dual sword wielding. So he decided to test his proficiency in a battle against a dual blade wielder. The two carefully looked at each other. To the Assam warrior, Daniel looked like a 14-years-old rank for martial cultivator. But from the strength he had felt from the throwing knives, he knew that his cultivation was much higher than that. As the current owner of the Jakrai, the least that could be said about this Assam warrior, was that he was great at recognizing talents. After all, it was his slave that at 10 years old had reached the late third rank and had won the right to be the Jakrai. At the same time, he looked at Daniel as seriously as he would have looked at his slave if he hadn't been tired and injured from the previous fights. The edges of the warrior's blades suddenly lit of a light yellow color, as he prepared himself for battle. The same happened to Daniel's swords when a pale blue light shone on their edges and prolonged the blade's length. Daniel moved first, throwing himself at the Assam warrior and making their weapons clash violently. Klein the Assam warrior confirmed Daniel's battle prowess at this very moment. He now knew that, not only was Daniel a late 5th rank, but he also possessed a perfect body. He couldn't help but think that, had he taken this young man at his infant stage instead of the blond young man, he could have been the prideful owner of the most powerful Jakrai in history. He was more than aware of what it took for someone to achieve a perfect body. As for the Assam race, a perfect body was much more important than it was for humans. The Assam warrior immediately pushed Daniel away, and as the two weapons separated, he slashed with his blade in the attempt to cut Daniel in half. Daniel promptly avoided the attack, and at the same time, summoned 20 tiny wind blades that roamed in the air around the Assam warrior, and attacked him from all sides. The wind blades were invisible, and only a spiritual cultivator or a high-ranking martial cultivator could notice them. Unfortunately, just as Daniel had guessed when he observed the fight between him and the blond young man, the Assam warrior was at the 6th rank of martial cultivation, and therefore, he was able to see the wind blades thanks to his surrounding awareness. The Assam warrior felt immediately disappointed about the fact that his adversary would allow a spiritual cultivator to aid him in a one-on-one battle. But after a few more exchanges, he started to feel that something was amiss. The wind blades and Daniel's movements were too well synchronized. A spiritual cultivator's reactions would be a lot slower than a martial cultivator. A spiritual cultivator would oppress a martial cultivator not only by attacking him from the distance, but also overwhelming him with many instantaneous attacks. The appearance of 100 stone spikes was much more plausible than 20 singularly controlled wind blades. A spiritual cultivator shouldn't have the reflexes to be able to do that. For 2 long minutes Daniel attacked, avoided, and disappeared from the warrior's sight just to reappear behind his back, sending 1 or more attacks. At the same time, whenever the Assam warrior would be forced to protect himself from Daniel's attacks, a wind blade would open a shallow gash on his body. Utterly confused, the Assam warrior couldn't help but become enraged and act rashly. After losing a large amount of blood due to the many cuts all over his body, the Assam warrior entered a crazed state and went into the offensive. One slash after the other, Daniel was forced to avoid or parry. One particularly strong attack forced him to lose his balance and take a step back. At that point, the Assam warrior dropped one of his blades and grabbed Daniel's wrist. His intention was to cut Daniel's arm right off, but the moment he touched Daniel's body and felt the powerful spiritual essence within, a shocked expression grew on his face. He immediately let go of Daniel, and while looking at him with stupor, he said, "Yeah, Thursday Shia Mjelji Napatfur." After he finished talking, a sudden realization filled his mind, changing his face from one of shock into one of urgency. After picking up his blade, he turned around and tried to leave, but before he could do that, tens of ice spikes charged with electricity attacked him from 10 different directions. He was more than prepared for the attack, but as he was about to deflect the last of these electrified spikes, the spike disappeared, leaving a path for a fireball to explode in his face, blinding him momentarily. Taken by surprise, 2 newly formed ice spikes pierced right into his shoulders. The Assam warrior, now laying on the ground and on the brink of death, took something out of the spatial bag that hung from his waist. A small bead rolled on the stone ground as the large Assam warrior lifted his arm in an attempt to smash it. As he was about to let his arm plummet on the ground, a guillotine-like blade cut his right arm clean off his shoulder. The Assam warrior looked at Daniel hatefully one last time, before a lightning-fast slash cut halfway through his neck, killing him. Daniel picked up the spatial bag and put the small bead back into it. He then walked towards the children with the intent of taking them to safety. Once again, he kneeled before the group of crying children, but as he was about to say something reassuring to them, he felt the blond young man approach from behind. He rose back to his feet and turned to look at the young man. His demeanor was as prideful as it was before, but now he looked significantly weakened. The blond young man had observed the scene carefully. After the death of his master by the hand of a person younger than he was, he approached him and said, "J. Cry Neba Finua." He then kneeled politely in front of him. Imblin and the rest had approached just in time to hear the young man's words. They all looked at Daniel with bright smiles on their faces. Daniel looked at Imblin and asked, "What did he say?" "He said that you are a warrior worth serving. That means that he recognizes you as his. I wouldn't say master. More like a savior to whom he owes an eternal debt," she said cheerfully. Daniel looked back at the blond young man with dubious eyes. Noticing Daniel's expression, the young man said, "Warrior. Serve." Chapter 65 With luck, rarity is relative. You are listening at novelfull.audio. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" asked Daniel while looking at Imblin. Imblin couldn't help but giggle in response to Daniel's words. Only after a good minute was she able to regain her composure and explain, "It's an Assam tradition. A warrior who saves their lives in battle will become a warrior worth serving. Now, serving might be a little bit of a stretch. It's not a master and slave, or owner and servant relationship. He simply respects you as a warrior and owes you his life, so he will fight for you." Of course, Imblin was more than aware of the possibility of this happening. That was the reason why she had prevented the others from helping Daniel out during his one-on-one fight with the Assam warrior. Slightly annoyed, Daniel asked, "Is it possible to refuse? You wouldn't deprive a warrior of the possibility of repaying such a debt, would you?" Imblin asked back. Daniel couldn't help but sigh and accept the situation. He then said, "You will have to teach me the Assam language." Surprisingly, the very next moment a book appeared in Imblin's hands. Daniel took the book off of Imblin's hands and put it into his spatial ring. He then walked towards the children, and after calming them down, he and the rest of the group lead them to safety. Only then did Daniel look back at the blond young man, and noticed that the red number had decreased by more than 200 points. After a night spent roaming the streets and killing off dozens of raiding parties through the city, the sun rose once more in the sky. It was now early in the morning, and the fighting noises had greatly reduced all around the city. People had started to come out of their hiding, as most of the raiders seemed to have been killed. Thanks to Daniel's group support, the city guard had managed to gain the upper hand in the war that took place in the streets. With less to worry about, the high-ranking warriors within the city were finally able to focus on their respective fights. Most of which ended in draws, and forced the invading party to retreat from the city. Despite the early hour, the city was extremely active. Thousands of people worked tirelessly to rescue those stuck underneath the debris of the collapsed houses, or tried to put the many fires out. At almost every street corner, 2 guards and a city worker would coordinate the citizens' effort to rescue and repair the damage caused by the Assam warriors. Daniel and the rest were now resting and eating at an inn. One of the people they had saved that night was this inn's owner, so they had been granted free lodging for as long as they wanted. During the night, Daniel had learned that the blonde young man had no name. According to Imblin, a dirt warrior's title was his name, and he would never be able to earn one for the entire duration of his life. Of course, Daniel was in complete disagreement with this rule, but since he didn't know him long enough to try to argue against his belief, he decided to drop the subject for the moment. It took Daniel only a few hours to perfectly learn the Assam warrior's language, and become capable of speaking to the blonde young man without Imblin's help. Thanks to the night spent killing Assam warriors, the young man's karma had decreased to a slightly red 25. Various high-ranking cultivators came to visit the group during the day, including the city lord. They came to thank them for their support in time of crisis, and deliver small gifts of appreciation. After an entire day spent by meeting powerful warriors and company's representatives, Daniel and the rest left the city and proceeded on their travel towards the empire's capital. 2 additional weeks passed before Daniel and the rest were finally able to reach the next city. This city was extremely large. Possibly larger than all the other cities Daniel had seen combined. When they approached the immense city walls, he noticed that even the guards at the gates had a cultivation of at least the 5th rank. They stood quietly near the enormous gate and controlled the impressive flux of merchants and carriages that tried to enter the city. What surprised Daniel the most, was how often a rich-looking merchant would be denied entry, and forced to step aside to allow the guards to inspect their inventory. Their turn arrived only after 2 long hours of waiting. Fortunately, aside from a few weird looks directed at the blonde young man, the guards found no good reason to deny entry to them and simply allowed them in. When they entered the city, a badly dressed bunch of kids approached the group and assaulted them with questions. "Welcome to Dresden. Will sir be needing a tour of the city? Guide service for the kind sir, only 1 silver per day. Best tour guide in Dresden. Only." Daniel immediately noticed how some of these kids were doing the same kind of games to train manual dexterity that he used to play when he was their age. They weren't simple tour guides. They were pickpockets. Daniel couldn't help but smile, and look for the most badly dressed amongst them to hire. At the back of the group, was a black-haired 10-year-old girl dressed in tattered clothes. By her side, was an even younger boy which she held by his small hand. This young girl didn't seem to be a pickpocket. She looked more like a beggar who had recently decided to attempt to become a tour guide. She was shy and didn't talk. The only thing she did, was to stand in the crowd and brush the back of the little boy's hand with her small thumb. Daniel approached the little girl and said, "Are you a tour guide?" "Why? Yes sir. I know the hotels in the area and..." she said with a shy expression. She clearly wasn't used to being a tour guide, causing the sudden interaction with an unknown person to make her blush uncontrollably. Before she could finish, Daniel interrupted her by saying, "Great. I was really eager to find a room to stay in. Let's go." The little girl immediately nodded back at him, and started the tour she had prepared. Despite the impressive number of people walking around, the streets were large enough to prevent them from creating a human blockade. Daniel and the rest strolled the city while observing the lively scenery. In the 20 minutes they had followed the little girl, they had seen dozens of hotels and at least 10 marketplaces. The little girl's preparation had left Daniel impressed. She had clearly prepared a very efficient route to guide her customers in. The only problem was the little boy, which because of his young age, had some difficulties in keeping up with his sister's pace. It was only half an hour later that the group had decided to take a pause for the sole purpose of letting the young boy rest. In order to avoid making the little girl worry, they had pretended to be interested in visiting one of the shops in her route. When they were about to resume their travel, Imlan approached the little girl with a gentle smile, and asked her if she could carry her little brother herself. The little girl looked very scared at first, but after hearing the gentle tone of the teenage girl and noticing the tired state her little brother was in, she accepted. The group resumed their tour, which now proceeded at a faster speed. A few minutes after resuming their tour, Daniel and the group found themselves in the borders of a large square. This square was tightly packed with people which crowded around a small arena. In this arena, a shop had been set by an odd-looking middle-aged man. What classified this man's appearance as odd, was the fact that he looked like a beggar. His dirty and greasy hair were unkempt, and his face was covered by a thick beard. His clothes were of high quality, but they had been worn so much that they had lost their original luster. Despite the crude appearance, he was sitting behind a very elegant stall, on which a large amount of rings and jewels were being neatly exposed one next to the other. The man's stall occupied the middle of the square, and yet nobody dared to complain or yell at him. Instead, they quietly observed from afar or approached the stall politely. Daniel and the rest of the group wouldn't be able to know who that middle-aged man was, but for spiritual cultivators capable of sensing the surrounding essence, it would be extremely clear that each of the exposed items were spatial containers. From the politeness Daniel could see coming from the surrounding crowd behavior, he guessed that that man was the creator of those items, and therefore, a spiritual cultivator which had comprehended spatial essence. Spatial essence was one of the hardest essences to comprehend, and the reason for that was simple. Space, like sound and time, were omnipresent. People were born into a world of space, time and sound. They were born and lived inside space, their lives were dominated by time, and they communicated through sound. Being these three essences integral part of being a human, humans had never had the ability to feel them to begin with. Unlike other kinds of essences to which humans had to get used to in time. The only ones who were able to comprehend those three types of essences, were those who had found an anomaly in which they were particularly strong, or had comprehended them from an essence sphere created by another spiritual cultivator. Needless to say, each of these cultivators were highly valued by the kingdom or empire in which they resided in. Seeing how large the crowd around this stall was, Daniel could guess that this middle-aged man was no common spatial enchanter. So he decided to stop at the square, and take a look at the rings the man was selling. The moment he joined the line, his luck kicked in and people started to leave one after the other. This Karma X luck is amazing, thought Daniel as he watched the noticeable effects of his most expensive system skill yet. In just a moment, the time they needed to wait in line was halved. Of course, luck could only do so much. It couldn't exactly force people to work in Daniel's favor, but it could make slight changes. For example, the reason why half of the people in line had left, was because at the head of the line, the first customer had shouted, "What do you mean by pass on your knowledge? Why can't you just sell me one?" Apparently, the middle-aged man didn't put his items for sale. Instead, he was looking for a spiritual cultivator to whom he could pass on his knowledge of spatial essence. Daniel wasn't really sure if this could be attributed to his system's passive skill, but he was definitely not going to let this chance go. He was either going to leave with a good spatial ring, or even better, a comprehension of spatial essence. Despite the extremely high offers the middle-aged man received, people were rejected one after the other. It didn't take long for Daniel's turn to arrive. With a serious look on his face, Daniel approached the stall and said to the man, "Can I take a look at one of those rings?" The middle-aged man looked back at him and said, "If you want to buy one, then just leave. I want to check if you have what it takes to teach me something about spatial essence," said Daniel with a casual tone. In front of the shocked looks of the surrounding crowd, the middle-aged man didn't get offended and instead said while grinning, "Suit yourself then." Chapter 66 It's only spatial essence. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Daniel's wisp of consciousness was now standing in the middle of an empty space. He had just started to examine one of the many rings and jewels that the middle-aged man was displaying, and yet he had already been greatly surprised. What surprised him wasn't the immense space inside it, as all the spatial containers that Daniel had seen contained a relatively large space already. What surprised Daniel about the ring he was currently in, was how different the space in it felt from other spatial containers. The space was hundreds of times more stable than that of any other ring he had found. It didn't feel like a large and feeble box adrift in space. Instead, it felt like a stable different dimension. Simply by standing inside the ring, Daniel was convinced that he would be able to reach a faint comprehension of spatial essence if he wanted. He quickly withdrew his key and found himself back in front of the middle-aged man. "So, what do you say?" asked the man, with a grin still present on his face. Daniel looked at the middle-aged man with a surprised expression and asked, "These aren't spatial containers." "They are not. They are called pocket dimensions and you can store anything inside it. Even people. Of course, you need to create an appropriate atmosphere so that anything can survive inside," responded the middle-aged man. That wasn't the first pocket dimension Daniel had seen. In fact, he had been carrying one for a very long while. The difference between these rings and the greenhouse ring that the old alchemist had given to him, was that space wasn't a major component of the latter. It could still house people within, but the space was much more unstable, and barely adequate for plants to grow in. At the moment, Daniel couldn't figure out what the middle-aged man's motives could be. He had checked the man's karma more than once, but unfortunately, that hadn't been as helpful as it had always been in the past. Since when Daniel had met the blonde young man, he had learned something very important about his karmic system's ability to read other people's karma. That something was that he shouldn't judge someone solely based on their karma points. What he should judge instead, should be the circumstances and actions of a person. What karma indicated was simply a person's disposition to pick the wrong path, but even that could be forged. For example, a good person could be forced to do something evil, or a bad person could do good things for the sake of appearance. Daniel felt very lucky for having met with one of those cases amongst people with bad karma and not the other way around. Had he found a bad person who had taken the habit of doing good things for the sole purpose of keeping up the appearances, he might have been cheated by now. Or worse. Of course, the system was not perfect. There was also another bane to Daniel's unique ability. And that was people with relatively neutral karma. Daniel used to speculate that these people were simply shut-ins who focused on their cultivation and training. Therefore, he was never able to make out their intentions solely by looking at their karma. The middle-aged man, unfortunately, was one of those people. Above his head a red number 10 floated steadily. "What do you want?" inquired Daniel in a doubtful tone. With curiosity in his eyes, the middle-aged man looked back at Daniel and said, "Nothing." "Okay. What do you want me to do then?" asked Daniel, sure that there was more hidden behind the man's simple response. The middle-aged man grinned at him and said, "I am looking for a disciple. If you will be able to obtain a high enough comprehension of spatial essence, I'll take you with me to a gathering, and give you a ring as a reward." "What sort of gathering?" asked Daniel with undeniable interest. Unable to hide the smile behind his dirty look, the middle-aged man responded, "A gathering of experts, of course." Daniel looked back at the rest of his group and said, "What do you guys think?" The first one to respond was Rowley, the only other spiritual cultivator in the group. "What is there to think? Do you know how rare it is to find a teacher for spatial essence?" His tone was agitated, as if worried that Daniel would refuse. Daniel's eyes moved on the others. It sounds shady. But if he is telling the truth, then it might be worth it. Any of these spatial rings could store the. You know. Said Heimart with a matter-of-fact tone. The blond young man was currently looking around, clearly uncomfortable with the strange looks the people in the crowd were sending him, and yet fascinated by the liveliness of the big human city. I need critical thinking, muttered Daniel impatiently. Nobody showed discontent at him for placing his stall right in the middle of the square. That indicates that he is a known figure. He also didn't approach you secretly, and made his offer out in the open instead. Said Alice before taking a slight pause. She then continued, finally, it is not uncommon for such an occurrence to happen with spiritual cultivators of that age. They spend all of their time studying and researching essences, and the only reason they are able to do that, is because they are funded. Let's say he is being funded by the Empire. He would need to prove that he isn't a dead investment by showing himself at the various official events along with a capable disciple. After a good half-minute, Daniel turned back towards the middle-aged man and said, if I accept, will I become part of the Empire's return of investment? Of course not. I made sure with the Empire that whomever I will teach spatial essence to, will have the right to decide if or when to become part of the Empire. As long as you don't decide to become part of the Crehan Empire, you will be free to do whatever you want. Responded the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's words made sense. No matter how talented a youth was, it would be worthless without a teacher that could impart something useful to him. That was the reason why the Empire had accepted the man's request. As long as they had him, they could find another young and talented spiritual cultivator to pass his spatial essence comprehension to. I accept. Said Daniel, finally convinced by the man's words. The smile on the middle-aged man's face grew larger, splendid. Are they with you? He then asked while pointing at the rest of the group. Ye. Before Daniel could finish to respond, he and the rest of the group had been absorbed by space, and teleported into a different place. Taken by surprise, Daniel and the rest of the group found themselves in an odd place. They could all feel a slight difference between the world they were in now and the one they were used to, but except for Daniel and Rolly, they couldn't understand what was different about it. Where are we? Asked Imblin. Trying to resist the urge to puke, Rolly grabbed his knees and said, not in the outside world if that's what you are asking. Probably inside one of the man's pocket dimensions. That's right, said a voice resounding in the air, this is the pocket dimension I've decided to give him if he won't fail my expectations. The voice belonged to the middle-aged man. It is. It's not the one I would have picked, asked Daniel with confusion in his voice. The man appeared right in front of the group, and while looking at them he said, it's big enough to keep your castle in, isn't it? The man's words petrified the entire group. Oh please. Do you think I wouldn't have felt the residue of spatial essence on you? He asked while looking at Daniel. How many spiritual cultivators who comprehended spatial essence do you think there are? The clear mage might have had a deep comprehension of many essences, but space wasn't one of them. Many spiritual cultivators had worked on that formation, and amongst them was an ancestor of mine. If you knew about the formation, why haven't you tried to warn people about the dangers of entering the tournament? Or even do something about it yourself? Asked Daniel. With a slightly mocking tone, the middle-aged man responded, haven't tried. Have you ever tried to tell someone that their hopes and dreams are garbage, and that the entire reason for their sect, or group's existence is to die inside a faulty trap? Plus, the tournament took place for 2 months every decade. How powerful do you think I was 10 or 20 years ago? I was 20 then. For crying out loud. All right, good point. Said Daniel while raising his hands in surrender. When will we start? Right now. We don't have much time to make you reach a decent level of spatial essence comprehension. Said the man without hesitation. He then indicated at the surroundings, and said, get out of this space, before disappearing. Slightly irritated by the man's impulsive actions, Daniel was about to start focusing on the spatial essence when Imblin's voice came from behind him. "We might have a little bit of a problem," she said while still holding the little boy in her arms. The little girl with black hair was standing next to her as well, holding her leather pants. Daniel couldn't help but sigh and say, "Give them Lagarte's candies. Keep them happy. It won't take long." 2 hours had passed since the group had been teleported to the foreign space, and Daniel had spent them sitting and sensing every detail of space he wasn't used to. Atmospheric pressure, gravity, lack of natural essences. Every one of these details had been a hint that could aid him in his comprehension. It was only after the 3rd hour that Daniel had started to feel the feeble connection between the space they were in, and the ring which contained it. Once found the ring, he immediately recognized the space the ring was in, and in front of everyone's eyes, he disappeared. The very moment Daniel disappeared from the space, the middle-aged man reappeared. He said with an amused expression, all right, the joke is over. I'm taking you boo. Where is the kid?" His expression showed confusion, as if something he couldn't understand had just happened. "I think he left the dimension," responded Heimart calmly. "That's ridiculous, I have put you all here to show him the difficulties of comprehending space. There is no way he was able to leave in a few hours," he said with a slightly irritated voice. As if someone had tried to refute his expert opinion. He was about to leave the pocket dimension, when suddenly, Daniel appeared once again right next to Lagarde. The middle-aged man was about to say something to him, but before he could, Daniel and Lagarde had already disappeared. The middle-aged man immediately left the pocket dimension, and what he found outside, was a solitary Lagarde which stood right in front of him with a face filled with confusion. The very next moment, Daniel appeared outside of the pocket dimension along with the blonde young man. Alice, Heimart and the rest were taken out one after the other in the span of 10 seconds. Unable to believe his own eyes, the middle-aged man kept staring at Daniel for a few minutes before managing to regain his wits and say, "Damn monster." The idea that Daniel could be an old cultivator had never crossed the middle-aged man's mind, as in his eyes, Daniel looked like a simple young man in his mid-teens that had reached the 4th rank. His rank certainly showed talent in cultivation, but it was nothing as prodigious as what he had showed by learning how to connect to an external dimension, and leave it in just a couple of hours. It had taken the middle-aged man more than 6 months to learn how to do the same thing when he was younger. The only difference was that his teacher had actually left him in there for good, instead of going back for him after only a couple of hours. "What's next?" asked Daniel teasingly. Chapter 67 Stuck once again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. "What's next?" asked Daniel teasingly. Slightly irritated by Daniel's tone, the middle-aged man looked back at him and said, "Very well. It seems that your aptitude for spatial essence is nothing to laugh at. How about something a little more difficult then?" Before Daniel could respond, 120.8 different rings appeared from out of nowhere, and started to orbit around the middle-aged man. From the middle-aged man's body, just as many threads of spiritual essence emerged and joined the rings. Inside the rings, each thread turned into spatial essence of different properties, which once again emerged from the rings and entered another one randomly. Daniel could feel the 120.7 spatial connections that were being formed, but before he could memorize them, his surroundings rapidly changed just as many times. After so many teleportations, even he couldn't help but fall on his knees and vomit everything he had eaten during the day. He then dropped unconscious on the ground. When Daniel woke up, the first thing he noticed was that he wasn't in empty space. Instead, he was lying on a large expanse of rocky ground. No matter where Daniel pushed his spiritual essence, he could not feel anything but earth essence and the unusual space essence. After spending a minute focusing on earth essence, within the space essence, he found feeble connections to at least 10 different pocket dimensions. Without any idea of which passage he should go in, Daniel picked one at random and entered it. Once on the other side, Daniel immediately felt the water essence. The water was in an aerosol state, inside which small wisps of solar essence fluctuate randomly. Once again, Daniel could feel multiple exits inside the unusual space, but none lead outside. The only thing that put him on a good mood was a sudden and unexpected window that appeared in his mind. Underscore 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 freedom for all. Second objective complete. Reward 2500 karma points underscore 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 underscore. They did free him, muttered Daniel as a faint smile grew on his face. Unfortunately, Daniel didn't have many reasons to be happy right now. He was still trapped inside this place and he couldn't seem to figure out how to leave it. Without a better option, Daniel decided to travel between the many pocket dimension and increase his comprehension of space. With a serious expression and eyes filled with determination, he jumped straight into another spatial passage. An unknown amount of kilometers away from the Crehan Empire, 5 distinct people were currently sitting in a large and elegant throne room. In front of them, 2 men were standing quietly, while a third kneeled in between them. If Daniel was present, he would be able to immediately recognize the 2 men standing as his first 2 teachers. Master Kai, and the Silver Alchemist. Kneeling in the middle of the room, was an extremely skinny man. His head was low, and his muscles were so thin that he seemed to have been just taken out of an isolation cell. His eyes were closed, as he didn't seem to be used to so much light anymore. His sickly white skin was almost completely covered in grime, and he couldn't help but cough every now and then. Sitting to the sides of the room were 4 people. The first one was a man who appeared to have reached his early 60s. He wore extremely elegant clothes, and seemed to be a wealthy merchant. The second was an old man whose body was covered under a large coat. If someone could take a look at the old man's body, they would be shocked by the impressive muscles he was hiding. He had no weapons on him, which indicated his proficiency with martial arts and hand-to-hand combat. His body was filled to the brim with dense ki. On the other side of the room, a man that seemed to be in his 40s sat quietly. He held a long and showy scepter in his hand, and wore a light blue robe. On his robe, the water essence danced quietly as if the very fabric itself was the surface of the sea. The fourth person was a young-looking woman. She wore a thick layer of makeup, making her look not a day older 30 years old. Her body was too well hidden underneath a green robe to verify her age. The last person present in the room was the one who sat on the throne. He wore a golden plate armor, above which the heroic story of how a member of the Rallis royal family had exterminated the old owner of the land, had been carved neatly. This man was, of course, the king of Karolys. His name was Kalmurellis, and he was the 517th member of the Ka lineage. The main lineage within the Rallis family. He was currently sitting on his throne, and he didn't seem to have spent his past few weeks in a carefree way. These 5 people were the current most powerful people, and only 9th-rank cultivators within the kingdom of Karolys. The current king, the chairman of Karolys's branch of the Merchants Collective, the leader of the Mist and Ice sect, the previous head of the Klein family, and finally, the poisonous dame. "Is this him?" asked the king to Master Kai. Master Kai looked back at him and said, "Yes, your majesty. We have already verified that this man is indeed related to Dan of the Heels. What would you suggest we do?" The man in elegant clothes immediately rose to his feet and said, "Your Majesty, he is a slave of the mining conglomerate, which belongs to the Merchants Collective. He should be under our care." "Like hell he should," barked the leader of the Mist and Ice sect viciously. He then pointed the scepter at the elegant man and said, "If we give him to you, you'll sell him for a pat in the head from one of your superiors. He stays in Karolys. The silver alchemist took a step forward and said, "Your Majesty. If I may. Dan's sister is almost to the main branch of my golden cauldron. Don't you think it would be better to take his uncle there as well, and let him reunite with his niece?" "Silence!" shouted the leader of the Mist and Ice sect. "You have no right to talk here. Not only have you sent the kid to an unknown place, you have also taken his sister into your own group. How is that not treason? That was the only choice. Hadn't we done that, he might have been dismembered within the dungeons of another castle as we speak," retorted the silver alchemist with a matter-of-fact tone. "Quiet," said the king with a deep voice. "The kid's uncle is here, along with his 2 teachers. Unless somebody else finds out about him, there is no reason not to think that he will come back to Carolus." Master Kai immediately took a step forwards and said, "Your Majesty. There is something else I would like to discuss." His voice was tense, showing the importance the matter had to him. "I would like to talk about Mayahor Rulin." "What about her?" inquired the king with a slightly overbearing voice. He was clearly sick of hearing Master Kai talk about the Rulin family since the very moment he had retired from being the Master at Arms. "She was adopted into the Heels family. I am not sure about the reason, but I know that she is of great importance for the 2 siblings," said the Master Kai while slightly bending the truth on his favor. "Where is she now?" asked the king. With a slightly nervous tone, Master Kai responded, "Together with Dan's sister. She should be reaching the main branch of the Golden Cauldron any day now." "Are you confessing to have offered shelter to a traitor?" shouted the head of the Klein family. Not many knew about it, but the Klein family was the family from which the current leader of the School of Everlasting Fury had come from. Naturally, the Klein family had been prohibited from taking the sides of the School of Everlasting Fury in the past, but now that Master Kai had retired from being the master at Arms, and the number of experts had decreased to a point where their family alone was a huge chunk of Carolus's power, there was no reason not to anymore. "Me? I wouldn't. My friend here simply noticed the similarity when he sent both of them to the main branch of the Golden Cauldron," said Master Kai while pointing at the silver alchemist. "I then investigated and found out who the girl was." His tone was innocent and devoid of guilt. The silver alchemist turned to Master Kai, and through a fake surprised expressions, he said, "She really was the Rulin's brat daughter. I thought my old eyes had tricked me. Enough. The girl is outside of our borders. And if Master Kai's words about the talent of the heel kid are true, I don't want to risk making him angry the very moment he will come back because of an old feud," said the king with an exhausted tone. He then asked, "What are the updates on the neighboring kingdoms?" Once again, the leader of the Mist and Ice sect got up on his feet and started to talk. "As His Majesty knows, the Zan and Yumelin are aware of the kids back within the depths of the middle-aged man's spatial trap. A week had already passed, and Daniel had visited more than 200 pocket dimensions. He was deeply confused by the amount of different pocket dimension he had seen. After all, he had only need less than 130 rings. His comprehension of spatial law was now much more refined and deep than before. He could feel the connections between the rings, but before he could hook his spiritual essence into the space of the outside world, the external ring would be absorbed by another, starting things over and over again. He felt as if he was trying to swim against a rip tide. No matter how fast or how close he was, the current would always push him back. "Come on. Think outside the box," muttered Daniel. Within his mind, Sua was unable to take it anymore. "Just stop teleporting. How many times are you going to make the same mistake? Are you learning how to bend space or are you learning how to chase geese?" He suddenly burst out. "What is that supposed to mean?" asked Daniel confusedly. Sua sighed deeply, then responded, "Just create a pocket dimension. Mess with this stupid formation and get us the fuck out of here. You really don't like teleporting, do you?" Daniel couldn't help but ask him. He then thought about Sua's suggestion, and after realizing how impossible it was, he still managed to make a more realistic version of it. The pocket dimensions were more than the rings. That meant that, at some point, a ring's essences would be manipulated into creating a different space. If there was something that any spiritual cultivator knew, was that essence's weakest stage was during the moment it would be shaped. Daniel started to jump through dimensions once again, except that this time, he did it backwards. After he passed the 60th dimension, he finally entered one in which space was turbulent, and completely unstable. Only a faint wisp of stable spatial essence lingered within the dimension, and that essence belonged to the outside world. Daniel immediately linked himself to it, and in less than a second, he was once again in the outside world. He quickly looked at his surroundings, and noticed that he was in an empty room. Behind him, was the formation inside which the 126 rings rotated, assimilated each other, and morphed. After a simple look at its workings, Daniel understood how the formation really worked, and how he was supposed to leave. The easiest way to leave the formation, was to lock the space within any of the pocket dimensions, then wait for change to take place. The external space would react to the locked space and, unable to change it, would make the formation collapse. What forced Daniel to spend so much time inside it, ironically, was his talent in comprehending space. The middle-aged man had prepared this trap so that a normal talented spiritual cultivator would take days to comprehend the space within each dimension. After a few days the change would reach them, and sooner or later, they would figure out how to stop it and make the formation collapse. Still satisfied by his result, Daniel quietly left the room. Chapter 68 Time is in constant motion. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Daniel left the room, he immediately recognized where he was. He was currently standing inside one of the corridors within the castle. What left Daniel pleasantly surprised, was how different the castle looked since the last time he had seen it. He could still feel his control over it, but the entire castle had been renovated with higher-class furnishings. It didn't take long for him to guess the reason why. He had spent an entire week within the spatial formation, and of course, the rest of his group and the middle-aged man would not simply waste time while waiting for him to come out. Daniel was currently inside the spiritual training section of the castle. If he could shift into the fictitious space made by the clear mage, he would probably find himself close to the very rooms he had been tested into before reaching the catacombs. Now, it was a relatively empty set of rooms. Almost afraid that he would be immediately sent into another more complicated spatial formation, Daniel decided to spend the next few minutes exploring the renovated castle. After wandering for about a minute, Daniel noticed that the castle's new furniture looked extremely elegant and expensive. He could guess that whomever took care of the job, had expensive tastes. Each and every piece of furnishing was made of high-quality wood, and each patch of fabric was as soft as silk. Thanks to his system's passive skill, Karma X Luck, Daniel had been able to avoid being spotted for an entire hour, until finally, someone exited from one of the room and noticed him. The person who had spotted him was none other than the blonde young man, and the room he had just come out of was the weapon-wielding testing room. For the past week, the blonde young man had taken the habit to spend most of the day inside that room to train his mastery in single-bladed sword wielding. When the blonde young man noticed Daniel, he immediately bowed as a sign of respect. He then stood still and said in the Assam language, "Greetings, head warrior. Are there any instructions you have for me?" Daniel was now fluent in the Assam language, and despite his pronunciation of a few words was still a bit off, the blonde young man managed to understand him well enough. He responded, "None. Keep doing what you were doing." He was about to turn away and leave from one of the corridors, when instead, he turned to look back at the blonde young man and said, on second thought, "Why don't we have a spar for a bit?" The blonde young man accepted immediately with a decisive nod, and went back inside the training room. He then removed both weapons from the stone altars, and walked into the ring in the middle of the room. Daniel had spent the last week improving his comprehension of spatial essence, so now that he was finally able to have some physical exercise, he was fairly enthusiastic about it. He walked on the opposite side of the ring, and placed himself in front of the blond young man. After a slight bow, a clean sword appeared in his hand. The blond young man quietly unsheathed a single-edged sword, and took his usual fighting stance. Silence reigned supreme within the training room, until suddenly, a flash of light was reflected on the surface of the young man's sword, as it was sent slashing the air in half and towards Daniel's chest. The sword slash was immediately parried by Daniel, which after deflecting the blow, immediately countered with a diagonal slash directed at the young man's shoulder. Blow after blow, flash after flash. For the next few minutes the room was filled with sounds of clashing metal and brilliant sparks. It didn't take long for Daniel to realize something. His mastery of the sword was in no way superior to the mastery the blond young man had reached with single-bladed swords. And that was not all. Not only were their skills in swordsmanship comparable, but the young man's superior level in martial cultivation had granted him an edge over the fight. His reflexes were more evolved when compared to Daniel's, and his reaction to his opponent's blows were slightly faster. From the outside, it would seem like two training puppets were fighting a relentless and even fight, but to the eyes of an expert, it would be clear that Daniel had a slight disadvantage. Of course, for hundreds of times Daniel had the chance to finish the young man off with a simple magical attack. But he wanted this sparring match to be fair. They were both martial cultivators at the 5th rank, and they both decided not to use martial arts during the fight. What Daniel could do instead, was to change weapon in the middle of the fight. The first chance to do presented itself when he found himself in a bad position following a failed piercing attack. The young man had avoided the attack completely by spinning in place, and following the rotating motion of his body he countered with haste. The slash was horizontal and was directed at the shoulder blade behind Daniel's right shoulder. It was extremely difficult to avoid, so instead of avoiding it, Daniel made his left hand slide under and past his stretched right arm. When the single-edged sword was about to reach Daniel's shoulder blade, before the blond young man could stop his own blow and claim victory, the sword clashed against the shaft of the spear that had just appeared in Daniel's left hand. Daniel immediately bent the spear to absorb the blow until its shaft was as curved as a bow. He then made the shaft of the spear reach its maximum bending capability, before releasing the tension from the bottom and making it snap towards the young man's face. The young man's reaction was, once again, amazingly fast. He immediately jumped high in the air and used his whole body weight to support his sword in withstanding the spear's blow. The spear's blow was so powerful that it forced the young man's body to be pushed even higher in the air. During his descent, Daniel quickly retracted the spear and made it rotate by 180 degrees, before sending it towards the exact point in mid-air where the young man would have found himself in just a few moments, with a firm and decisive piercing motion. Beyond Daniel's expectations, the young man's body twisted in mid-air in response, and with his free hand he grabbed right underneath the spear's head, diverted its trajectory, and while still rolling over the spear's shaft, he slashed towards Daniel with a vertical motion. The only thing Daniel could do, was to ditch the spear and somersault past the young man's body. He then immediately got back up on his feet, and pointed the short sword that had magically appeared in his hand at the young man's neck. The young man was bent on his knees, but only one hand was touching the ground. The other hand tightly held his single-edged swords, which was now pointed at Daniel's side, ready to slide in between his ribs and pierce his heart. A faint smile grew on Daniel's face as he took a step back, and said in the Assam language, "Amazing. The progress you've made in the past week is really impressive." The blond young man bowed deeply in response and said, "If only you had my age and cultivation level, I could never myself compare to your ability." Daniel waved his hand in embarrassment. Honestly, the blond young man was the most talented martial cultivator he had ever met. Not only was he under 20 years old, but he had already reached the level of mastery of single-edged sword that the Dark Warrior had in the past. therefore making him capable of defeating the final form of the training dummy. One could understand the young man's dedication in swordsmanship from that alone. After exchanging a few more words, Daniel left the training room along with the blonde young man, and continued to explore the renovated castle by himself. Before long, Daniel had managed to find the position of the rest of the group. Heimart, Alice, Legart and Imblin were currently arranging the furniture within one of the rooms. The two kids were also present within the castle. They had been inadvertently teleported nearby the castle by the middle-aged man, but when Alice found out that they were orphans and had nobody to wait for them home, nor a home to come back to begin with, she had offered them a job as first members of the castle's cleaning crew. Daniel entered the room that his group members were currently decorating. The first one to spot him was Legart, which dropped his end of the drawer he and Heimart were carrying, and approached Daniel immediately. "Daniel! You are out. Please do something. That girl is crazy. She spent so much money on this stuff." Legart burst out with an imploring tone. Clearly amused by Legart's behavior, Daniel responded with a smiling face, "I thought you didn't like eating on tables encrusted with dried blood. I think that if you ask Alice, she could arrange a room for you decorated with the discarded furniture." "Ha! Ha! Ha! Very funny," responded Legart with an unamused tone. He then said, "Why don't you ask her how much she spent on renovating the castle?" Daniel shrugged his shoulders and said, "It doesn't matter really. We have plenty of money for no. It's 3 millions. Said Legart, interrupting Daniel's train of thought. "What?" Daniel suddenly burst out. The figure of Heimart quickly approached the two, while cleaning his hands on his pants. He said, "Hold on. It's not just for the furniture. We have also renovated the library, and with the help of the middle-aged man, we made projects of reconstructing the spiritual training section of the castle. That's what increased our expenses so damn much." "Where is the middle-aged man?" said Daniel curiously. "And where is Rolly? I can't feel him inside the castle." Heimart took a small locket from within his spatial ring and threw it at Daniel. He then said, "He is in here." The man said that this is a failed pocket dimension. Inside it, space is extremely chaotic. He said that it is the fastest way for someone with absolutely no comprehension of spatial essence to gain some. He also said that it is like giving a dictionary to an illiterate person. So go figure. Daniel pushed a whips of spiritual essence inside the bead, and noticed Rolly rotating and twisting in the middle of unstable space. His clothes were covered in vomit and he looked stressed beyond words. With a single thought Daniel surrounded him into his spiritual essence and forced him out of the failed pocket dimension. The moment Rolly appeared, he looked around and said, "Finally. I was supposed to stay in that hell for only a day. What the hell happened?" "Yeah. About that," said Heimart with a strange tone. He then took a brief pause before adding, "The middle-aged man left about 10 hours after he put you into the pocket dimension. He hasn't come back yet." Shocked by the ludicrous reasoning of the middle-aged man, Rolly took a deep breath and said, "I need a damn bath. I am going to drown anyone that comes to bother me." He then walked out of the room and towards his with heavy steps. "Okay. What else is new?" asked Daniel while secretly enjoying the liveliness of the place. It was at this moment that Alice and Imblin had finished to assemble the curtains. Alice came down of the ladder she had climbed on, and said, "We've found out the reason for the gathering." "Oh, that's interesting. What is it?" asked Daniel curiously. "Apparently, when we were busy with the tournament, a strange event took place." She then took a brief pause before continuing, "The only ones who felt it were spiritual cultivators who had reached a deep comprehension of time essence, but according to the rumors, time reverted back by 4 seconds. Chapter 69 When Dreams Are Born. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Time reverted back by 4 seconds. Said Alice with a casual tone. Daniel couldn't help but feel a little surprised by Alice's words. What else could have bent the world's omnipresent law of time during the tournament but his system's passive ability, second chance? It would be too big of a coincidence to be believable. Forcing a smile to appear on his face, Daniel said with a jubilant voice, "That's amazing. Maybe I'll find someone who can teach me time essence there." "Sure. But be careful. A single touch by any other cultivator, and you're screwed." Even after months, the news of a dual cultivator appearing hasn't reached us yet. "So I wouldn't expect a kind welcome if they were to discover your secret," said Heimart with a matter-of-fact tone. "Don't worry about me. Why do you think I am studying spatial essence for?" said Daniel with a confident tone. He then looked at Legart and said, "Try to touch me." After a moment of confusion, Legart approached Daniel and tried to put one of his hands on him. The very moment his hand was supposed to touch Daniel, the shape of space around him started to change. His hand was only a few millimeters away from Daniel's body, and yet pushing his hand past those few millimeters seemed impossible. To Legart, the feeling was that of moving his hand into empty space, but what was really happening was that Daniel had bent the very space that surrounded his body. No matter how one moved within the space he controlled, they could never move in the direction of Daniel's body. It was like trying to catch a wet bar of soap with wet hands. Unfortunately, this method was only useful for preventing people from accidentally touching him. On the other hand, it would be completely useless in case of a fight, or in case someone really tried to get a hold of him, as he would need to overpower the other person's ki and spiritual essence within the bent space, in order to force them to submit to the space's bent laws. If he wanted, he could prevent Alice and the rest from touching him ever again. The only person who could manage to find a way around this layer of protection, would be the blonde young man, as his ki was similar to Daniel's in both density and power. After a few missed attempts, Legart gave up and went back to help Heimart with moving the surprisingly heavy drawer. Daniel left the room and went to check the only part of the castle he had blocked with the help of the formation. That room was, of course, the clear mage's childhood bedroom. The reason he had blocked it was to prevent anyone from reading, copying or memorizing the cultivation path written clearly on the wall. As for any other room, the walls and floor were covered in dried blood. The only difference between this room and the others, was that this room didn't have many furniture inside, and instead of bones of teenagers and young men and women, it had bones of dead children. Since the moment Daniel had reset the formation, the bones had restarted their usual decay. The reason why the bones hadn't turned into dust yet was because, at least according to Daniel's assumption, the clear mage had sealed the castle and removed any natural element that could deteriorate the inside of the castle. The reason for that, was probably to prevent the writings on the wall to be damaged by the elements like wind, humidity, and heat. Now in full control of the castle, Daniel tried once again to set the wall on fire. With a simple wave of his hand, a thin veil of orange flames expanded through the entire surface of the wall. 2 minutes later, when the flame had finally extinguished, only a large patch of black could be seen covering the wall and leaving no trace of the cultivation method. Daniel lifted the block on the room and left for his next stop, the renovated library. After a few minutes of walking, Daniel found himself in a long corridor with 3 doors per side. All the doors on the left side were the entrances of the Library of Spiritual Arts and Magic Tomes, while the rooms on the right side were the entrances to the Library of Martial Arts and Skills. Daniel entered the Library of Spiritual Arts and Tomes, and inside it, he saw the new and elegant sets of bookcases that covered the walls of both floors, and the middle of the room's floor. Between the 2 bookcases in the middle of the first floor, was a long table surrounded by comfortable chairs. A set of stairs brought to the second floor, where there was no floor. Only a meter and a half large corridor with a handrail to the side that circled the entire room. Despite the small number of windows, the room was illuminated magically. It almost looked like the bright rays of the sun penetrated the walls and shone brightly on every corner of the library. Daniel took a slow walk towards the semi-empty bookshelves, and only stopped after reaching the section marked as Handicraft. He remembered to have seen most of these books. They were mostly the books he and the rest had recovered from within the many spatial containers inside the castle. The others had been bought by Alice and the others as essentials manuals that any decent library should have. Amongst them was the book which Daniel was looking for. On the cover, a clear writing spelled differences and creation of essence orbs and spheres. Daniel took the book and sat quietly in one of the many comfortable chairs around the library. It didn't take long for Daniel to memorize the entire book and its three main concepts. The first concept was the difference between essence orb and essence spheres, of which Daniel was already aware of thanks to his encounter with both types of artifacts. To put it simply, an essence orb was a simple container in which the manifestation of a specific essence, or mix of essences was stored. It could be used for demonstrative purposes along with the help of a specific formation. Extremely different from it were essence spheres. Essence spheres were created by condensing a large amount of essence and binding it to an essence treasure of the same property. The method of creating these artifacts was what Daniel was really interested in. In order to create an elemental sphere, Daniel needed to have an essence treasure with the same properties of the essence he wanted to create a sphere of, and a few other items. For example, in order to create a metal sphere, Daniel needed various types of rare and common metals to add to the treasure in order to ease the process of binding. Fortunately, two of the three spheres which Daniel was interested in making, happened to be the two easiest spheres to produce. Specifically, wind and water, of which he already owned the treasures of and of which had a deep comprehension of. The method of creation of an essence sphere was completely different. One did not need any sort of object, except for an orb that contained a simple pocket dimension, which when activated would switch a set space with the space contained inside the pocket dimension. The set space was isolated and prepared for easy shifting in the formation that would activate the orb. In Daniel's case, the formation that had activated the lightning orb when he had entered the first testing room for spiritual cultivators, was the altar placed right underneath the rotating pyramid of essence orbs. Daniel did not have any orb which he could use to create an essence orb, so he decided to attempt creating two different essence spheres instead. He opened his hand, and inside a small coral appeared out of nowhere. An experienced spiritual cultivator would immediately recognize this piece of coral as a high-level treasure of water essence. If not for the fact that it was an item commonly found on the bottom of the sea, the thick water essence that it emanated would betray it as a water treasure right away. Daniel possessed a good 90% of comprehension of water, wind, and lightning essences. For him it wasn't hard to use his spiritual essence to simulate most variation of water that existed. The only problem was caused by his limited amount of spiritual essence. Creating an essence treasure required speed and precision. Daniel didn't lack precision, as his comprehension was atop an impressive level. What he lacked was the speed that usually only an higher cultivation level could grant. No matter how talented Daniel was, he still had a limited amount of spiritual essence within his body. And in order to produce an essence sphere, he needed a constant and deep source of it. Fortunately, this wasn't a real problem for him, since thanks to his karmic system, he could produce ki way faster than usual, and use it to replace the consumed spiritual essence. Daniel put the book back in its place and left the library. He then headed towards the room where he had been tested the first time by the clear mage. Just like Heimart had said, the formation had been replicated in the original space of the castle, and now worked just like the version the clear mage had installed within the fictitious space. Daniel sat right in front of the altar, and started to slowly push his spiritual essence around the piece of coral. He then turned it into a water essence which encompassed the treasure completely. Layer after layer of water essence morphed around the treasure into different compositions. The deepest layer was made of cold and dark water, inside which only high-ranked abyssal monsters would live. The second one was made out of a thick and resistant layer of ice, through which nothing could be seen clearly. The third layer was made of a calm and gentle surface of water, similar to the shore of a beach. It swayed back and forth in a slow and repetitive motion. The fourth and last layer was a mist which lingered on the surface of the calm water. Half of it was made of scorching vapor, while the other half was a cold mixture of water particles and small ice crystals. The objects needed to aid the binding of a specific essence to its treasure were the various types of the essence itself. Just like an earth sphere would require plants and dirt to aid in the binding, a water sphere required ice, vapor, water and mist. Daniel was now ready to condense the water essence inside the small watery world. He started to fill the small room with as much spiritual essence as he could, before turning it into water essence and moving it towards the essence sphere. It was like feeding a flame from inside. Every bit of essence forced inside the sphere would automatically disregard Daniel's previous control, and become part of the essence sphere. It took Daniel a full day, and the astonishing amount of 5,000 karma points to finally complete the creation of the water sphere. It was very similar to the one the silver alchemist had lent him, but with the difference that this sphere was created by his own comprehension, and therefore, it could not help him increase his comprehension of water essence. The only reason he had created this essence orb, was as a first step to create an effective training ground for spiritual cultivators. Creating a water essence sphere at first, was only so that he could aid Roly in increasing his comprehension of water essence. After all, Roly was the only other spiritual cultivator beside him, and like him, he was adept in the use of water essence. Daniel's main goal for this training room, was to fill it with spheres made out of a perfect comprehension for each type of essence. Until recently, Daniel's thoughts had been much simpler. He wanted to live an easy life with his sister. What changed his way of thinking, was the gift that the karmic system had given him. The ability to dream bigger. Excited about his uncertain future, Daniel stored the water sphere within a box and placed it inside one of his rings. The very next moment, a feather appeared in his hand.